My name is Jay Jacobs. I'm an appointee of the governor, and there is no chair of this commission. So for the moment, I'm coordinating, but we will, in essence, while we don't have a gavel, we're going to pass the gavel, and each member at certain points in the day will preside over the meeting. I'll start it off just to get us going, but first let me begin. Kimberly, do you want to start down at that end? Introduce yourself and how
Sure.
you're appointed. Thank you.
Is this on? My name is Kimberly Galvin. I'm an appointment of Minority Leader Brian Kolb in the New York State Assembly.
David Brevett. I'm an appointee of Senate Minority Leader John Flanagan.
I'm John Nona. I'm an appointee of Senate Majority Leader Andrew Stewart Cousins.
Henry Berger. I'm the joint appointee of the governor, the speaker, and the majority leader.
Denora Gatacho. I'm the appointee of Senate Majority Leader Andrew Stewart Cousins.
I'm Mylan Dennerstein. I'm an appointee of Governor Cuomo.
Great. And I know that both Crystal Rodriguez and Rosanna Vargas, who are appointees of Speaker Hasty, are on their way, and they will be here in a timely fashion, I am sure. So we will open this up. The first part of the hearing is going to be from expert testimony. We have a tight schedule, ladies and gentlemen. Every person giving testimony will have 20 minutes. You certainly can submit written testimony or other written documents to supplement your testimony, and we will take those, and if you don't have copies, we'll make copies and distribute those copies. At the 18-minute mark, you will be notified that you've got 2 minutes left, and at 20 minutes sharp, the mic does turn off because we have to keep this rolling, and I apologize for that, but that's why we do have the written testimony. Any members have any issues or questions?
The only other thing is that during your 20 minutes, you may be subject to questions, and that comes out of your 20 minutes. So if you're less than concise, you're more likely to get questions.
To be clear, we are to ask questions within the 20-minute allotment and not
If we
after
can.
completion of the testimony.
Yes.
Okay.
And just to be clear, for the people out there, I do have a resolution that I'm going to bring at some point. I don't know if we want to bring it now or when there's a break, or I don't think it's going to take very long.
Okay. We have 2 members that aren't here just yet.
Are they coming?
They are.
Oh, all right.
Okay. So, Kimberly, I appreciate it. We can hold on that for a few moments. Okay. Let me just see here. Yeah.
We can get started.
We can get. Yes. I'm sorry. Yes. That's. Why don't you? Okay.
I just want to let everybody know that we now have a website that's publicly available, and it's a much easier way to communicate with the commission than all of us individually, and we're readily available. Now, of course, you need the name of the website. And it's Campaign Finance Reform, New York, Gov. So that will hopefully help in our ability to communicate effectively with anybody who would like to interact with us. Thank you.
And Crystal Rodriguez texted me. She is just about here. Needed the room. And if I could ask Richard Deberfault, could you just take the seat just so we can be ready?
You may commence.
Sorry.
Go.
We can get started.
Should I start?
You got a minute ahead of schedule.
All right.
So let's go.
All right. Is this on? Yes, it is. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Good morning. My name is Richard Berfault. I'm a professor at Columbia Law School, where I have taught and published extensively in the area of campaign finance regulation, including public financing. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. This commission has been entrusted with an historic opportunity to revitalize New York State's electoral system and enhance the accountability of elected officials to the people. I hope my comments will be helpful to you as you take on this crucial task. My comments today have 4 parts. First, I'll summarize the reasons why public financing is a vital reform for our democratic electoral system. Second, I'll briefly review the constitutional framework which governs campaign finance regulation, including public financing. Third, I'll provide a brief overview of existing state and local public funding systems. And finally, I will conclude with some suggestions for the basic elements of a successful public funding system. To begin with the goals of public funding advances multiple goals essential for a democratic electoral system. First, public financing programs, particularly small donor match type systems, increase political participation. Public financing makes small private donations more valuable to candidates. That encourages candidates to seek out small donors and leads to an increase in the number of people who take part in the campaign finance system. This can contribute to strengthening political activity across the board. Small donor fundraising today is increasingly based on social media and peer-to-peer networks, which combine fundraising with other forms of political engagement. Thus, the small contributions that public funding encourages can strengthen democratic participation more broadly. Second, public funding helps office holders, candidates, and the political process as a whole by reducing the time distraction created by big money fundraising. When candidates are financially dependent on large donors, they have to spend a lot of time dialing for dollars or attending large donor fundraising events. Many of these donors are not constituents, and even those that are will have government and public policy interests that diverge from those of ordinary voters. Candidates have less time to meet with ordinary voters, and office holders have less time to focus on their official duties, develop public policy, and help their constituents. Public funding can enable candidates and office holders to do their jobs better. Third, public funding promotes electoral competition. The current system tends to favor those with better access to large private contributions, such as incumbents, who can leverage their offices to obtain contributions with those who have interests affected by government actions, candidates supported by wealthy interest groups, and candidates who are personally wealthy. Public funding can lower this financial barrier to entry and make running for office open to a wider and more diverse range of candidates. There is evidence that public funding programs reduce the number of uncontested elections and lower incumbents' margins of victory. That can make office holders more accountable to their constituents. There is also evidence that public funding increases the number of women, minority, and political newcomer candidates. The purpose of elections is to give voters real choices and to enable voters to hold office holders accountable. By increasing electoral competition, public funding contributes directly to these goals. Fourth, a public funding program is needed to address the undue influence of great wealth on our elections and the political system more broadly. With private funding, candidates for a party nomination must participate in a wealth primary to win the backing of big donors before any voters get to cast their ballots. In the general election and once in office, the structure of our campaign finance system forces candidates and elected officials to give special attention to the concerns of major donors and potential donors. Public funding can offset that pressure, freeing candidates and office holders to take positions and pursue policy goals that advance the interests of the community as a whole rather than just the constituency of big donors. Public funding is constitutional. Indeed, given the Supreme Court's hostility to spending limits, public funding is the only constitutional means of promoting the goals of enhancing electoral competition, reducing the burdens of fundraising, increasing political participation, and promoting political equality. In its landmark 1976 decision in Buckley v. Vallejo, the Supreme Court sustained the presidential public funding system Congress had adopted in 1974. The court determined that public financing advances the general welfare in 3 ways: by reducing what the court called the deleterious influence of large contributions on our political process, by facilitating communication by candidates with the electorate, and by freeing candidates from the rigors of fundraising. The court went on to say that public financing as a means of eliminating the improper influence of large private contributions furthers a significant government interest. Buckley's statements about public funding are significant, as Buckley is also the case in which the court held that restrictions on campaign money trigger First Amendment scrutiny, that spending limits will almost always be struck down, and that even contribution limits will be subject to exacting review. The court contrasted public funding with reforms that would limit campaign money by emphasizing that public funding advances First Amendment values by providing campaign money. As the court declared, public funding of candidates facilitates and enlarges public discussion and participation in the electoral process, goals vital to a self-governing people. The court has continued to sustain the constitutionality of public funding and did so in subsequent cases. But the court placed a significant restriction on public funding programs in a 2010 decision involving a provision of Arizona's public funding law that authorized the payment of additional public funds to a candidate who had a high-spending, privately funded opponent or was targeted by high-spending independent groups. The court held it was unconstitutional for a state to use high levels of opposition spending against a publicly funded candidate to trigger these were called trigger systems, to trigger additional public funds for that candidate. The court said that higher levels of public funding in general would be fine, but that tying the amount of a candidate's public funds to the amount spent against that candidate unconstitutionally burdened the opposition's spending. An increasing number of states and cities provide public funding. Currently, at least 14 states provide some public financing option for campaigns, and another dozen local governments, most prominently New York City, Los Angeles, and Seattle, have implemented or are in the process of implementing some system of public funding for candidates. In recent years, candidates taking public funds won races for governor in Hawaii and Maryland, while Arizona, Connecticut, and Maine have implemented public funding programs for both statewide and state legislative elections. These statewide programs have now been in place for multiple election cycles. Maine's program was adopted in 1996, Arizona's in 1998, and Connecticut's in 2006, and have been credited with increasing the competitiveness of elections, increasing the number of candidates able to run for office, diversifying the candidate pool, and expanding voter participation in the campaign finance process, and reducing the burdens of fundraising. Closer to home, New York City's program of multiple matching public funds for small donations has become a national model, copied by a host of other jurisdictions, primarily cities. Over 3 decades, it has operated to expand the number and diversity of candidates, increase electoral competition, and especially to broaden and diversify the donor pool. These programs take a variety of forms, but 3 patterns dominate. Matching funds programs, like New York City's, that provide public funds to match small donations, usually at a several dollars to one ratio. So-called clean money programs that provide a qualifying candidate with a grant intended to fully fund the candidate's campaign. And voucher programs, with voters given vouchers that they can donate to candidates who then redeem the vouchers for public funds. At this point, however, only one place, Seattle, has adopted vouchers, which were used for the first time in municipal elections in 2017. Although the principal statewide programs to date have followed the clean money model, the small donor multi-match program is a particularly good fit for New York State. More than Clean Money's flat grant, small donor match works by providing an ongoing incentive to increasing public participation in the campaign finance process. The more donations you raise, the more money you get. With small donor matching, fundraising closely resembles campaigning to ordinary voters, so that fundraising is less a distraction from campaigning and more a component of it. Small donor matching also does a better job than other systems of linking the amount of funds a candidate gets to the intensity of the campaign. And of course, New York City's experience of implementing and revising the program in light of its ongoing learning of how the program works in practice is a great resource for the Commission. Finally, I'd like to explore a couple of the elements of a successful public funding program by focusing on 3. That the program be attractive to viable candidates, that it promote electoral competition, and that it operate at a reasonable cost. First of all, public funding will achieve its goals only if politically viable candidates, that is, candidates who would otherwise be able to fund their campaigns through private donations, agree to participate in the public funding system. And that will occur only if public funding provides candidates with funding adequate to pay for their campaigns and does so in a timely manner. The importance of adequate and timely funding is underscored by the fate of presidential public funding, which is still on the books, although it's not used. In 1974, Congress created a public funding program for candidates in presidential primaries and the presidential general election. But due to the inadequacy of the funding provided, and especially its failure to keep pace with rising campaign costs, and the late payment of primary funds, that program has not been used by any major candidate in the last election cycles, and I should probably add by any minor candidate recently, and is essentially moribund. Given Supreme Court decisions that guarantee the rights of privately funded candidates and interest groups to spend without limit, the Commission ought not to require candidates to accept the spending limit as a condition for receiving public funds. This may be the only controversial thing I say today, given I think the good government community may be divided on this point. So I will just sort of make this point, say a couple sentences of why I think spending limits are a bad idea. To be sure, most existing public funding programs do require candidates to accept a spending limit. probably nearly all, but given the changes in the law, it's always hard to be sure exactly what's happening right now. But in a world of unlimited private spending, a spending limit on a publicly funded candidate can operate as a form of unilateral disarmament for a candidate facing a personally wealthy or high-spending opponent or facing opposition from independent groups. Moreover, as I earlier mentioned, the Supreme Court has invalidated the most effective mechanism for responding to high levels of opposition spending, which would be to provide supplemental public or trigger funds. So there is no existing mechanism for responding to high levels of opposition. The amount of public funds provided can, of course, be capped at a level appropriate for the type of election. You don't have to provide unlimited public funds, but a participating candidate ought to be able to raise and spend money above that limit, subject to reasonable contribution restrictions. Even without a spending cap, public funding can still advance the goals of increasing small donor participation, increasing competition, and offsetting the power of big donors. Second, public funding is a key goal of public funding is to promote competition, and that requires that public funding be provided in both primary and general elections. Many legislative districts in the state are effectively dominated by one of the major parties. The only real electoral competition in those districts will occur in the primary. Consequently, public funding must be available for qualifying primary candidates as well as in the general election. Finally, reasonable cost. Public funds are taxpayer dollars, and taxpayers are entitled to know that their funds are not wasted. That means appropriate rules to deal with hopeless candidacies, with candidates who are effectively unopposed, and with the misuse of public dollars. To deal with hopeless candidates, to qualify for public funds, a candidate should be required to raise a threshold number of contributions from donors within the candidate's constituency. That demonstrates that the candidate begins with some real grassroots electoral support. Conversely, candidates who run unopposed or who have opponents who raise only very low levels of funding, rendering the candidate effectively unopposed, should not receive public funds, or at most only a nominal amount. And finally, the public funding law should spell out that public funds can only be used for clearly defined election-related purposes, with appropriate audit and enforcement requirements that make sure public funds are not misused. I hope these comments are useful to you, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
I have a question. You talked about spending limits, Professor. Do you think this commission has the authority under the enabling statute or under the Constitution to set contribution limits for various offices, for non-participants?
Right. I haven't looked into that. Certainly under the Constitution, contributions limits are allowed. Both under federal Constitution, I assume the state Constitution, contribution limits exist. To be honest, I would have to parse the enabling statute better. I hadn't focused on that before I came in today. But certainly, I was focusing more on the contribution limits of, that you could impose on candidates who take public funding. I can get back to you on that, but I don't have an answer
Can
for
you please?
Sure.
Very interested in your views.
Sure.
I worked with you on the State Bar Association Committee on the State Constitution.
No,
You were very helpful there.
It's a great
So,
question.
yeah.
I don't know the answer.
Thank you.
Professor, if there were to be expenditure limits, is there a mechanism that permits the raising or eliminating expenditure limits based on either high-spending, non-participating candidates or independent expenditures? Have you any experience or thoughts on how such a thing could be implemented?
That's a good question because the Supreme Court case is known as Arizona Free Enterprise leaves that unclear, to be perfectly frank. So that was a case in which the state gave more money. If all that happens is the state lifts the limit, I don't know. On the one hand, if that action is triggered was the kind of the term of art that was used in the other case, by the high spending, you could argue that, and I'm sure it would be argued, that that was being used to punish the high spending, privately funded candidate or the independent group. On the other hand, they're not providing any more money. The state is not providing any more money. So my short answer is I would be happy to defend it, but I wouldn't be confident of the outcome.
Are there any other states that you've looked at? You mentioned a number of states in your in your presentation. Any other states you think have a provision that we should consider in their campaign public campaign financing law?
I think the Connecticut Clean Money one has some interesting provisions about how they vary the thresholds. I mean, obviously, I've spoken at high levels of generality. You've got to think about what the qualifying thresholds are. for the different levels of office. But I think one thing to look at would be how they develop thresholds. But frankly, I do think that, from many respects, the best model is, and you're going to hear more about the New York City system today, I know from who the witness list is. The New York City model has been tested for longer than any of the state ones. It's been around for just about 30 years, and I think, I wouldn't say it's perfect, but they've worked out a lot of the kinks. I'd be curious to see how vouchers develop, but I'm skeptical. The big problem with vouchers is we never know how many people are going to redeem their vouchers, so you don't really know how much money is going to come from public funds. Whereas we have a good sense of both how small donor match works. The other thing, ultimately, it's not your solution, but down the road, is there has to be a mechanism to keep studying the system. People learn how to use the system, things happen. And the one thing is that whatever you produce will not be the final result. As all the systems have had to cope with legal change, with technological change. So one thing was more general to design it in a way which obviously certain things should be indexed, but in a way that it doesn't freeze itself in, and it has to be open to future development. But I mean, it's important to get started, and the system you're going to promote will take effect in the early 2020s. But I think you've got to build into it ways in which it can be revised in the 2030s, as people have learned how it works, as technology changes, as costs continue to change.
Professor, you mentioned in your testimony about the evidence that public financing increases candidacies of people of color and women. Would you mind sharing that with the commission later on, if those are in terms of
I'm sorry, I didn't
studies?
hear the tail end of that.
Would you mind sharing that with us at some point?
I can. I think some of your other witnesses today actually are more teched up on the data. In fact, my guess is a lot of what I rely on is what Michael Mulvin has produced, and I know you're hearing from him in a few minutes, so I'm going to hand the baton over on that to him, as well as the reports, actually, of the New York City Campaign Finance Board, which has done you're going to hear from them later also, which has done a very good job of tracking that information in New York City over the last several decades. So my guess is they're going to be better on that than I am, because I'm kind of the opening act here. You're going to get more substance from them.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Professor, one question.
No.
You had mentioned the presidential primary, the presidential system, and your rationale for why that system is not being utilized is that it's underfunded.
Several things. They didn't adopt a lot of money to begin with. I have to point out in the 1972 election, the person who lost by one of the biggest margins in history spent $30 million. The campaign finance system began with $20 million. So they began low. It was indexed, but it's indexed to the cost of living. Campaign spending has grown at a much faster rate than the cost of living, significantly faster, partly because of technology. So the campaign costs have
So you're
skyrocketed.
running on time.
And
My question is just simply that.
It was not enough
important
money.
That we focus as much of the $100 million that we're working with.
We can't hear
to the candidate.
I don't know if your mic is on. Oh, okay. You should begin with current levels of spending, but recognize that that's going to grow. The other thing is timing. The other thing that killed the presidential system for primaries was that the law provides that the money isn't paid until January 1 of election year. Well, you can see they've been spending now for a year. But the primary calendar was much later in 1972. Primary calendar has moved up. So there's heavy spending now in the year before, whereas under the public funding system, no dollars can be paid until January 1. Similarly, in the presidential election, the money isn't paid until after the conventions. In recent decades, most nominations have been resolved months before the election. The candidate has used his or her money up in winning the nomination. Then there's the so-called bridge period of, say, 3 months, where they're done with the primary, they don't get any general election funding. So they had to turn to in effect, soft money, and then ultimately gave up on the system. So it's those kinds of more technical things, how quickly the money is made available. Is it key to the rhythm of a campaign? And I think the presidential system might have been key to the rhythm of the 1972 campaign. It was no longer key to the rhythm of campaigns in 1996, 2000, 2004.
Do we have time for just one more quick question? I was just wondering, I was looking over the other states that you referenced, and I too have looked at those, and I was wondering, do you have a breakdown of how they were enacted? I know some were, like for example, New York City, a charter amendment, some were the legislature, some were public referendum.
Connecticut was legislation, Arizona was voter initiative, I think Maine was voter initiative, but I'm not 100% sure.
And how many were a 9-member unelected panel?
Probably none, but
Okay.
but I don't have that off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Professor. Irene Fonseca Sabun, Chief Democracy Officer of the New York City Mayor's Office. And I apologize, but could you state your name again?
Yes.
And your office, and do it, I was told we have to do it directly in to the microphone and as clearly as you can for the folks outside listening, okay? And
Sure.
everybody on the commission, I think I was just told, we have to speak into the mic, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Irene Fonseca Sabuni, and I'm the Chief Democracy Officer for the City of New York. Thank you to the Commission for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to provide testimony. The Democracy NYC initiative aims to increase voter registration, participation, and civic engagement in New York City. It was created with the guiding principles of making it easier to vote and to run for office. The city's investment in its robust public financing program reflects its commitment to this goal. We are proud that New York City is a national leader in campaign finance reform. Since I began in the role of Chief Democracy Officer, I've heard from New Yorkers from every walk of life, in every borough, in high schools, community centers, faith communities, senior centers, and town hall discussions. Through these conversations, I've learned a great deal about how the public feels about our democratic process. People are disillusioned. Many don't believe elections are fair or that those without financial means have a voice in the process. Democracy NYC was founded by the mayor with the principle of increasing public engagement in this process. In order to accomplish this goal, we must first build trust between the people of New York and our electoral system. Establishing this trust begins with rooting out corruption and any perception of corruption in our system. We are pleased that the legislature took such important steps to improve the system of voting and elections this year, including eliminating the LLC loophole, and we look forward to working with the Commission on further campaign finance reform. People are fed up with the role that money is playing in our political system. New York State has a unique opportunity now to lead in one of the most important issues of our time. New York City has long been a leader on this issue, and while we recognize that the city is different from the state as a whole, we urge the Commission to look closely at the more than 30 years of experience of publicly financing elections here in New York City. I'm pleased that my colleagues from the Campaign Finance Board will later be testifying, and I expect that they will be a useful resource. Campaign finance reform is so critical to democracy that in his 2018 State of the City address, the mayor appointed a charter revision commission which proposed a plan to deepen public financing of local elections, with the goal of elections being primarily funded by public dollars. The proposal grew out of the idea that the way to address persistent, cynical perceptions of politics was to significantly lower campaign contribution limits for all candidates and increase public matching funds. These changes were overwhelmingly adopted by voters in November 2018. More than 80% of voters voted in favor. As you know, included in the changes was an increase in the matching ratio from 6-to-1 to 8-to-1 match of eligible contributions, and an increase in the total amount of public funds available to candidates who voluntarily opt into the program from 55% to 75% of the expenditure limit. This past June, the City Council further increased that amount to 89%. The charter revisions also reduced campaign contribution limits by more than half, lowering contributions for mayoral candidates from $5,100 to $2,000, and lowering contributions to city council candidates from $2,850 to $1,000. These limits apply to all campaigns, regardless of whether candidates participate in the matching funds program. Early feedback on the city's enhanced public financing system is positive. In the special election for public advocate in February of 2019, nearly all of the candidates opted in, and notably, the most common contribution was just $10. I'd like to reiterate how impactful it is that in a citywide election, the most common contribution was just $10. In the prior public advocate race, the most common contribution had been $100. In a post-Citizens United landscape, and with a complete lack of federal oversight due to the stalemate at the FEC, in this city, we have worked to make elections accessible to all New Yorkers. A 2012 study from the Brennan Center, and I know colleagues from there will later be testifying, found that 90% of census blocks in New York City included at least one small donor candidate to city council in the 2009 city elections, compared to just 30% of census blocks which had a small donor for candidates to the assembly in the 2010 election. The study similarly found that communities which donated to city council races were likely to have lower incomes and greater racial diversity than those that gave to assembly candidates, and that the pool of small donors was 40% more than in 2009 than in 1997, the last election before the single match system transitioned to a multiple match. As one elected official said, since the multiple match increases reliance on small donors, there is less need for a candidate to cozy up to special interests. For these reasons, the administration's view is that a critical component of a successful state public financing system will include a program that matches small donations with public funds, multiplying those donations by a factor big enough to encourage candidates to rely more on small donors and less on a few big contributions. Overall, the system must provide incentives for all candidates to participate. Otherwise, it will fail to achieve its core mission of enhancing public faith in the democratic process. In New York City, lower contribution limits for all candidates is one such incentive. In addition to public matching funds for small donations, the city's public financing system has an excellent track record of high participation rates. According to the CFB's post-2013 election report, 92% of all candidates on the ballot for the primary election were program participants. Of 168 candidates on the ballot, only 13 opted not to join the program. In 2009, the participation rate in the primaries was 93%. Participation rates are high for the general election as well, and the administration's view is that successful public financing program must offer public matching funds for both primary and general elections. The New York City system has been effective in being structured only to make funds available to candidates who meet specified thresholds and who have competitive elections. Another important aspect of New York City's system, as well as proposals from various government reform advocates, is lower contribution limits for candidates who apply to receive public matching funds, as well as those who opt out of the program. New York State's contribution limits are unusually high. Unless they are brought down, we are concerned that there will not be sufficient motivation for candidates to participate in a public matching program. Finally, fusion voting facilitates participation by more than two parties, bringing more voices to the table, and we believe encouraging greater participation. Further, the issue is outside the Commission's mandate. It is not mentioned in the legislation authorizing the Commission, and it has not impeded the effectiveness over the 30-year history of the public financing of elections in New York City. Candidates receive public funds only once per election cycle, regardless of the number of ballot lines they are on. The city law places caps on the amount of public funds candidates in smaller parties may receive. The Commission could look to New York City law as guidance on this. The administration encourages the Commission to focus its efforts on the important work of bringing public financing to New York State. We share the values guiding the Commission and look forward to further discussions on its proposal, its potential impact on state elections, and ways we can work together with the Commission, the legislature, and other stakeholders to continue to improve New York City and New York State's public financing system. Democracy NYC stands ready to assist the Commission. We look forward to working with you and others to restore public faith in our democratic process. I look forward to any questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What would you do to change New York City's system if you could, to improve it?
I believe New York City's system right now is very effective, as we see from the match, the most recent public advocates election, where the most common contribution was $10. I think right now the New York City system is working.
But that's not really my question, which I appreciate. And but what would you don't? Is there anything else you would do differently, or you think it's basically perfect as is?
I think it's not perfect. There are always room to improve. But I think it is a leader in the system, and with respect to specific recommendations, we could follow up with you on that.
That would be great.
Sure.
I would appreciate that.
Yeah.
In New York City, there's only with rare exception, there's only one election per cycle, the primary. There isn't a need for differentiating between those, between the primary and the general. In many other parts of the state, though, there are 2 elections that are contested. And several of the proposals create a per cycle match and a per cycle maximum amount of public funds. Does that really work in a state where some candidates are going to have 2 elections and may get a set amount of matching funds if they qualify, while those who have only 1 election get the same amount? I mean, does a per cycle system work across the breadth of New York State, which is very different from, just here in New York City?
Sure. Thank you for that question. We encourage the commission to look at what's working in New York. We know you all are going all over the state to look at what works in different parts of the state. I cannot sit here and say what's going to work in different parts of the state. And I think one of the challenges for the commission is making sure that the system will work in a very diverse state. So I think that's one of the ways that the system will have to meet the needs of the different parts of New York.
Just a couple questions. Your testimony speaks to the fusion voting issue, and you mentioned in your testimony that candidates receive funds only once, regardless of how many lines they're on.
In the New York City system, yes.
Yeah. So have you contemplated the notion of an elimination of fusion voting and what that would do to program costs? In other words, you're almost increasing this, you're increasing the number of candidates because candidates now are not on multiple lines. Now you have, instead of potentially 2, upwards of 6, 8 candidates now running, all eligible for the program. Has that ever been contemplated in New York City as to why it would be cost prohibitive to eliminate fusion voting with respect to public financing?
No, yes. Fusion voting has been a long-standing part of the system in New York City, and so it's not something that we've contemplated in terms. I think the point you're making sounds factually accurate, but it has not been contemplated changing it. But it sounds right to me.
That it would increase the program costs if we were to do that. I'm not suggesting that there's any intention right now to do so. I'm just wondering. I'm really concerned about the $100 million cap. And it sounds to me from your testimony and the professor's testimony, making sure that these candidates are provided a robust enough system to compete against other interests for them to participate is key to success. And if we take action that causes that $100 million to be unnecessarily spread, whether or not that jeopardizes the success of the program.
It's critical that that candidates are competitive. That's one of, I think, the principles that we think must be prioritized in the statewide system. And I think in terms of the specifics of fusion voting on that, we can follow up with you on that. But we believe that the commission should not address fusion voting.
You mentioned in the testimony that the city has placed caps on the amount of public funds candidates and smaller parties may receive. How does it do that?
So, yes. Based upon the number of voters, I have a note on that. Based upon the number of voters that are eligible, and I will defer to my colleagues in the Campaign Finance Board regarding the technicalities of the system, but for elections with less than 1,000 voters, I believe the cap is much smaller, how much they can receive total. So for very small parties, there would not be a huge expense. But I would expect that the CFB can better answer your question.
Thank you.
Speaking specifically to the question of enforcement and the Campaign Finance Board, can you explain a little bit more to us about the role that the Campaign Finance Board plays in administering the program and any recommendations about their authority that could be replicated at a state level?
Thanks for that question. With respect to how the administration works, I will let them answer all of those questions. It is extremely complex. The professor earlier spoke about different programs in different states. And I think that one of the jobs for you all is figuring out the best way to administer it at the statewide level, whether it's a model similar to the city or something that replicates what's happening in other states. But in terms of the specifics of the administration, the CFB is best situated to address that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Michael Malvin?
Oh,
Great. Yeah, we did get copies. Yes, thank you, Michael. You have an extra one?
If you have extra written
2 extra copies?
Yes, I do. I sent them yesterday.
Yep. I've got it. Thank you.
no, Brifalt is the first one.
Thank you.
Oh, I have yours. Very interesting, by the way.
Okay.
Members of the commission, thank you for inviting me to appear. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the first page of the written testimony that has my biography and all about the Campaign Finance Institute and the number of studies we've done on public financing, and including ones on New York. Instead, I'm going to go directly to the key findings from CFI's February simulations of the governor's proposal and his executive budget. They were as follows. They're at the top of the second page. Under the governor's proposal, the system would change from one dominated by large donors into one in which small donors would be most prominent. That's top of page 2. And I should say, it's not in the written statement, that this analysis included an analysis for public money for primaries as well as general elections. Like Professor Brifalt, I don't think the system works very well if it's only for general elections. From our research, we also know that new donors would be more diverse, both in terms of income and race. Some of our studies were cited by the previous speaker. We have many others that I'd be happy to send you. Second major point, virtually every candidate would have more money under the new system than now, even though contribution limits would be lower. And this is important because the system has to depend upon voluntary participation by candidates. Third, the cost would be low. Our estimates are roughly $240 million over the course of 4 years, or $60 million per year. I'll come back to the cost issue later because it's controversial. And then finally, as a major caveat, our report said that none of these benefits could occur unless one important provision in the governor's proposal was changed, and that was the one relating to qualifying thresholds. The governor's proposal had them too high, both in terms of donors and the amount of money needed to qualify, and that would have meant that most candidates would not have gotten the money. So those are the key findings, and now I want to take a step backward. The major conclusion from these for what lies ahead is that the budget law told this commission to establish a system of voluntary public financing that would serve some specific goals. No system is perfect. They're all going to have to be amended over time, but the key finding is that the governor's proposal would go a long way toward achieving the goals. Of course, the governor's proposal could be improved. It needs minor tweaks, but not, in my view, a major overhaul. I firmly believe, however, that any changes should be guided by careful analysis. The campaign finance system contains many moving parts. The budget law specifically mentions matching rates, contribution limits, public funding caps, qualifying threshold, geographic differences, administration, and costs. Changing any of them will affect the others. And in this situation, relying on instinct or personal experience alone is not the best practice. Analysis should precede decision. That analysis would not take long. It does require some specialized applications, but with simulations in hand, your deliberations should go more smoothly. Let me turn now to a few specific issues. First, matching rates. The governor's proposal included a 6-to-1 match, which is similar to New York City's old rate. That seems to me to be a reasonable matching level. Almost all candidates would come out ahead with that. Even with the lower contribution limits, it would provide real incentives for small donor fundraising. Our studies have shown that going much lower than that fails to produce the desired effects. On the other hand, there is a case that could be made for going higher. CFI served as consultants to the Mayor's Charter Revision Commission in 2018, and that commission concluded that 6-to-1 was not enough, especially for mayoral elections. It decided 8-to-1. I would consider 8-to-1 for governor, but only after running simulations to see the cost impact, which is a real issue, I understand. Also on matching rates, the Brennan Center suggested 8-to-1 in its model bill for contributions within a candidate's district, 6-to-1 for outside the district. I personally like the differentiation concept, but again, I'd like to think about the numbers. The idea here is to heighten the incentive for candidates to raise contributions inside the distance. I wonder whether 4 or 5-to-1 instead of 6-to-1 makes sense. I honestly don't know. The point, because obviously the goal of balancing has to be balanced again, the need to have enough money, so going too low outside the district might raise issues. Again, though, I'd prefer to run simulations. And again, that shouldn't be hard. We have geocoded all New York donors and put them into Assembly and Senate districts, so we could do this. And while on the point of incentivizing within district donors, it's worth noting that the governor and the Brennan Center and New York City all require contributions, qualifying contributions, to come from inside the district. Separately, on matching rates, Reinvent Albany recommends matching only the money from donors who give up to a certain amount, maybe $175 or $250. This would be instead of matching the first dollars from every donor. That would be a significant change, but not an unprecedented one. My question is whether it would leave candidates with enough money to join the system voluntarily. Again, simple simulation would tell us. On qualification thresholds, we strongly endorse the Brennan Center's approach over the governor's. As our February simulations made clear, the original qualifications requirement were far too difficult. And finally, none of the simulations would take long to do. Next, to contribution limits. Any discussion of contribution limits should begin by comparing New York's current limits to those of other states. 11 states place no limits on contributions, but among the ones, 39 with limits. New York's the nation's highest for gubernatorial candidates, second highest for the Senate, fifth highest for the Assembly. It's also substantially higher than the national median for all offices, especially for the statewide offices. So based on this, the governor's and Brennan Center's identical limits for participating candidates seem reasonable, as do their slightly different rates for non-participants. Both of them would reduce current limits, but leave them higher than the national average. There was a question asked earlier about whether this commission has the authority to reduce contribution limits for non-participants. I don't pretend to be an expert in the law about New York State commissions, but I do know that in practice, the contribution limits for participants and non-participants affect each other. And public financing would be affected by non-participating. That is, voluntary participation would be affected. Any changes should be run through simulations. There's another geographic issue that was raised or has been raised. I don't know if it is by witnesses, but there was a news article about the commission that reported an interest in having different public funding caps, upstate and downstate. That was floated also in 2014. I'll make two very brief points. One, this would not have a very big effect on the overall cost in the budget. Two, again, we could run a simulation, no big deal. Administrative issues. There's been some discussion whether the program should be administered by a new agency. Without commenting on that directly, I want to say that the experience of many jurisdictions shows a few issues to be crucial. One, the responsible agency must be fully independent of the public officials it regulates. Two, its budget must be free from punitive retaliation, which has been experienced in many states. It should have protected status, like the City Campaign Finance Board. Three, it needs that protection because its job is to enforce the law fully, fairly, and energetically without fear of reprisal. Finally, the agency should learn from well-established best practices of other agencies elsewhere to implement a customer service approach to ensure that most candidates have a positive experience with the process. Cost estimates. On the program's likely costs, I suspect some commissioners know that there's a significant difference between CFI and the Board of Elections. CFI has estimated the four-year cost to be about $60 million a year. The Board of Elections has put it at, quote, upwards of $100 million per year. I think it's worth noting that when there was a similar difference between us 5 years ago, the New York State Division of the Budget's estimate ended up being almost identical to CFI's.
So that's $60 million a year
Yes,
off the top of the 100 million.
60 million total for public funds and administration. I'll
Right.
get more to that.
Oh, for the funds and the administration.
That is correct. And that's a difference between us. And that was what the division of the budget agreed.
What match are you working off of there?
I'll be happy to, does this come off of my time?
I'm allowed to ask you questions,
I
sir.
know.
That's what you're
Sure.
here for.
I'll be happy to sit down. It's going to take a while.
No, I think it's, no, I'm just wondering, you're telling me that your projected cost is $60 million a year.
That is correct.
What is the match? 6 to 1?
Oh, the
4 to
match.
1?
I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I misunderstood you. I thought you said math. Match, the match was 6 to 1.
6 to 1, thank you.
6 to 1. 6 to 1 for primary in general. I apologize for mishearing you.
How many contested races did that consider, or did that assume?
It assumed a minimum of one contested race in every district, either in the primary or in the general. As you know, many districts have no contested races now. It also assumed an increase, a very substantial increase in the number of donors over the status quo. The totally static model came in with a lower number. And to get to the other point where there is a significant difference, we disagree with the methodology of the BOE for estimating administrative costs, where they just took the New York City Campaign Finance Board and multiplied it by the number of races. And we instead, and again, the details are in the February report, instead we used the New York City Campaign Finance Board produced a much more detailed analysis in which it looked function by function and scaled it up to state levels. And that's what we used.
This is the analysis on Table 2 of your report, page 12, where you have an assumption all candidates participated, and then you have one if there's new donor, you add new donors.
That's for
assuming
the
an
cost.
addition.
Yes,
And
that's.
that breakdown seems to, you conclude that the cost of administration would be 20 million, and the cost of the matching funds would be either 31 or 38 million, depending on the number of donors.
Yes, and I
I
think
got
we
that right.
explained the method. We did explain
Page
the
12.
method there. That is correct. Table 2, let me get to that, please. Yes, that is correct. And the lower table is the more expensive one, assuming more donors. Both tables assume more candidates.
Did you, I just want to make sure I understood clearly what you said, because I don't have the table in front of me. Did you say that assumes that there is going to be a competitive race in every single district?
Either in the primary or general, we assume that somebody would run and that the opponent would raise the amount that an average opponent raised. Now, that assumption you could question.
Yeah.
Say, maybe we have to assume more. And if you did, it still would not have a huge impact on the overall number.
I'm just trying to understand. So what you're saying is that there are 150 assembly seats.
Yes,
You're saying there could potentially be, under this model, 300 candidates, because 2 candidates
Yes.
in each seat, 300 candidates who would then be getting the funding?
I'm not assuming there would be. I'm assuming for the purpose of estimating costs, let's say there would be, because I think that's a very generous assumption in order to estimate costs.
But that's my question, because unless I'm doing the math wrong, if the cap limit was 300,000 in an assembly seat, let's just say, which is high, 300 times 300,000, I think, is 90 million right away.
If everybody hits the cap, you're right. What we assumed was that candidates would spend as much as the typical non-incumbent candidates spent, which they would not hit the cap. They would not come close. If they all hit the cap, you're quite right.
Because it could go well over the 100 million then, under that.
If they hit the cap. If there are just not that many viable candidates running.
But that's the point of the program, right? To encourage more participation?
Sure is.
So if the program works effectively and we get people to run, that's ideally what you've modeled it after, what we'd like.
If you could get people to run and they could get enough small contributions. So,
But that's the goal of the program.
absolutely.
So if it works effectively, that's what we're looking towards.
That's more effectively than it would be working anywhere. To get every district to have 2 candidates to max out.
Some of the upstate districts have far more than 2 candidates running in a primary.
But they don't come close, they would not come close to maxing out if they tripled the number of their small donors.
So you invest that amount of money into an office that the likely outcome is already known, but you're investing that 300,000 into that challenger that's not going to win. What is that producing in terms of increasing what? Just more races?
I'm sorry.
Are greater incumbents
I'm
losing?
doing this-
Are more incumbents losing? I'm not understanding.
No, I'm doing this for the purpose of estimating cost. Period.
And your estimate is based on current spending of challengers?
Current spending with a substantial increase in the amount of small donors and a substantial increase in the number of challengers. That is correct.
But they still have the same amount of money?
An increase in the amount of money because of an increase in the amount of small donors, because there's a small donor incentive.
But not
Yeah.
maxing out.
But not maxing out. That is correct. So the cost estimates, I think we already did the methodology questions because I think they've already come up. I just want to make 2 last points briefly in the 2 minutes and then take more questions. On a last substantive point, some assembly members have said, when I testified before them in February, that they feared that public financing would leave them more vulnerable to independent expenditures. That fear, in my view, just has no substance. We just signed an article to a peer-reviewed journal that shows that independent expenditures in the various states do not relate to campaign finance laws. They relate most strongly to competition. Candidates who take public financing will have more money under the new system, not less. That will make them better able to withstand independent expenditures, not worse. If they use small donor matching to strengthen their home district networks, that will make them still stronger. Even though the proposal would put a cap on public funds, it would let participating candidates raise money. There is no spending limits. Candidates who remain concerned can choose not to participate. One beauty of the system is that it is voluntary. Now, Mr. Berger asked earlier, what if there were an expenditure limit, and then it was lifted because of independent expenditure? What I'd be concerned about there is that the spending tends to happen at the very end, at a point when raising the spending limit, letting the candidate raise more, there's no time.
So you have no spending limits for participants. Your model assumes no spending limits for participants.
That is correct.
Okay.
So in conclusion, I'm going to conclude by stepping out of character, and the Campaign Finance Reform Commission has a rare opportunity to improve representative democracy in the state of New York. I urge you to take advantage of what is both a gift and a responsibility. You're starting with a model that's very close to what is needed, the tweaks are not major. They are not rocket science. However, the decisions would be better off with some modeling. Modeling should be transparent, so you can ask the kind of questions you asked me. So I close my statement by reiterating CFI's willingness to be helpful. If you have questions, respond.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Alex Camarda? Yeah, what we're going to do, Professor, we're going to get some questions by email to you that some of the members have, and perhaps you'd be willing to answer those. I'd appreciate it. Great, thank you. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Just to, for the record here, just to state your name and your organization again.
Sure. Good morning, Commissioners. My name is Alex Camarda. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for reInvent Albany. reInvent Albany advocates for open, accountable, and honest government. We believe the Commission should establish a strong public financing system in New York State that will be a model for the country. To us, a strong public financing program is one that has high rates of candidate participation, increased political contributions from everyday New Yorkers, independent and fair enforcement, and less special interest money. We think the Commission should focus exclusively on creating a public financing program and not be distracted by attention to fusion voting. I previously provided recommendations to the Commission, 18 recommendations that we made for a strong public financing program. We've updated 3 of those, revised 1 in the materials just given to you, and I'd like to highlight very quickly each of the 18 recommendations. Our first 5 recommendations deal with effective campaign finance administration and enforcement. The first recommendation is to create an independent campaign finance board outside of the Board of Elections.
What does that mean, Alex, independent?
Well, I'll go into that. To us, an independent campaign finance board is actually not just a board, but an agency. The city's campaign finance board has over 100 staff for 59 offices. The state has nearly 4 times that number at 216. And so it's important that the agency be robustly resourced and staffed. And we recommend spending $22 million for the administration portion of that. We think the Board of Elections should be limited to voting administration. Our second recommendation is to...
Why is that, though?
If I can run through these, I have it timed to about 15 minutes, and then I'll have 5 minutes for questions.
I just ran out of time with the last speaker, so as long as once your time is up, I can ask all the relevant questions I have no problem doing that.
I have 5 minutes at the end for questions. I'm happy to get into that, and some of your questions will be answered in our subsequent recommendations.
I've read it.
So on the second recommendation, we're calling for a mix of random and mandatory audits. Audits are done by the City Campaign Finance Board after the election cycle ends. The state won't have the luxury of a 4-year election cycle. We'll have to do them more quickly for more candidates. So we're calling for a statewide mandatory audits for statewide candidates, random audits for state legislative districts, although we think high-spending state legislative districts should receive audits automatically. Our third recommendation is to put a penalty schedule in law for violations of the law. That schedule should distinguish between repeat and one-time offenses, cured and uncured violations, and willful and unwillful infractions. And we think hearings should only be held when the violations sum to an amount that's above $1,000 unless requested by a candidate. Our fourth recommendation is to provide a fixed budget that will help to build in independence to the enforcement agency. We also believe that the program should begin in the 2021-2022 election cycle. That's our fifth recommendation. Our next four recommendations deal with maximizing participation by candidates in the program. We think that's essential for the program to be a success. You heard earlier that the participation rates in New York City are very high, typically 2/3 for general elections. 2/3 of candidates participate, between 80 and 90% for the primary elections. Important for candidates to participate is lowering the qualifying thresholds. We echo Michael Malbin's recommendation to lower the qualifying thresholds in the governor's bill. We have our thresholds that we recommended on page 8 in our recommendations. What we did is we took the city's thresholds, we applied an adjustment for the state's population to come in at a lower figure. I'll provide just one example of why the thresholds need to be lowered. In New York City, a candidate running for city council must raise $5,000 and $75 in district contributions. The governor's recommendation for the assembly is $10,000 and 100 matchable contributions, yet a city council district is 40% larger. I think that points to the need to lower the thresholds. Similarly, we suggest that for the governor's office, the thresholds be lowered by $100,000 and 1,000 contributions. Our seventh recommendation is to establish public match caps for the election cycle rather than per election. We think that gives more flexibility to candidates to spend the money as they see fit based on the competition they have during those elections. We did look at the 2018 election cycle. Of the 213 state legislative races, only 42 were competitive, meaning they were decided by 10 points or fewer, and only 3 were actually competitive for both the primary and general election. So we think that points to the need for the public match cap for the election cycle. I would also point out that 15 candidates for the state Senate spent more than $750,000 on their campaigns. The governor's proposed public match cap for state Senate is $375,000 per election, so you can see that that's inadequate for a very competitive race. For the statewide offices, we also suggest a public match cap for the election cycle, and we also think the public match caps could be lowered for those offices. For the governor's office, in his bill, he recommended $8 and $10 million for a total of $18 million in public match caps. We recommend $10 to $12 million. The reality is the governor's fundraising is an outlier. It's very inconsistent with what governors have raised in the past, both candidates and people who have held the office. And then for the statewide positions that are not governor, we recommend $5 million in public match caps. The governor recommended 4 and 4 for a total of $8 million. No candidate last cycle spent more than 5. And looking at the Attorney General's race, Tish James spent $1.7 million in the primary, just $577 in the general election. Again, we think that points to the need for a public match cap for the cycle rather than per election.
But excuse me, I'm just questioning, that's the city of New York. In the suburbs and in upstate New York, it's much more common that you have both a primary and a general election in competitive
The
races.
data we looked at was the 2018 state legislative races for Assembly and State Senate. So it could be, it was different in different years, but we're basing our data just on 2018. For
Now, what if you spend all your money in the highly competitive primary?
Well, we think that candidates will adjust accordingly. I mean, we provided the example of Tish James. I mean, she had a very competitive, in terms of money spent, general election opponent and several primary opponents, and yet she made choices how to spend her money.
A hypothetical candidate facing public funds need to be expended to survive, what does that candidate do after the primary?
Again, I think they'll make a choice based on having a certain amount of money for the cycle, and they'll use the public funds that they think are worthy of spending for that particular election, and the rest will be the private funds they raise.
So you could have a primary, heavily Democratic, whatever, Republican primary, all the funds are expended in that primary, and then the opposition can come in and have a significant advantage because they didn't have the primary that they had to go through?
Well, again, we're comparing it to a system where you have money allocated per election, and in that scenario, you're also going to have limitations. I mean, I pointed to the 15 state Senate candidates who spent more than $750,000. Under current proposals, they would only have $375 per election. So there's going to be limitations on the public funds, and we think having it for the cycle gives candidates more flexibility. Moving on here, recommendation 8, we recommend providing a public match cap for small contributions only. The reason for that is we don't think the taxpayer money should go toward large contributions, matching large contributions, the first portion thereof, given the state's very high contribution limits, which we think should be lowered. There is actually an example of this in practice in Hawaii. The only state with a public matching program for state legislative offices only matches the first the contributions of up to $100, even while having a contribution limit of $6,000. So it does not match the first portion of large contributions. Our ninth recommendation.
How does that get administered, Alex? I mean, I give $100 to a candidate, and then matching funds are paid out over time, and a week before the election, I give the candidate $1,000. And the candidate spent the money. Are you going to go and take back money? It's not, I mean, how do you administer that when there are seriatim contributions? And there are seriatim contributions.
I mean, certainly it complicates the administration. We think that can be addressed, and I think also candidates knowing that going in will fundraise differently. And if they get a later contribution, then yes, that would need to be refunded. It would need to be addressed in some way.
I would fundraise differently. I would make all my contributors going to be small contributions until the very end, and then I would go and seek the large contributions, knowing that I've already gotten my matching funds. I mean, in this world of social media, where people are giving money every week, every month, whatever, how do you keep, administratively keep track of when public funds should be allocated when you have no idea of what the final contribution from a contributor is going to be? I just don't see how administratively, we can possibly do that.
I think admittedly it would be more complex, but we believe that could be done. And I think that the candidates would raise money from small donors, calculate for the match amount, and if they could raise contributions above that amount, they would get them from larger donors. But you would have to set up an administrative entity that would refund, or the public match portion would be refunded by candidates if it fell beneath that level.
And it's further complicated by your recommendation that funds be made available 6 months before the election.
Yes, which is our next recommendation. We think they should be made earlier in the process. That's something we advocated for before the 2018 Charter Revision Commission, and the city is now putting that into place. They have a schedule by which full public fund payments can be made during the primary and the general election for the primary election before the ballot's finalized, and that gives candidates an ability to rely more on public funds rather than relying as much on private monies. Our next 3 recommendations are related to protecting public funds. Our 10th recommendation is to establish clear and detailed expenditure guidelines. It's very important that we protect public funds because this is taxpayer money, so we don't want to enable candidates to spend make campaign expenditures on items that should not qualify. And so we recommend that the commission provide a very detailed list of prohibited expenditures, and that should include use of public funds for elected officials' official duties. And we would also recommend that public funds not be used to pay relatives or for so-called dual-use purposes, like a car that could be used for campaigning but also used by the candidate for personal purposes. We think certain contributions should not be matched. The governor's bill has a good starting list prohibiting public matching funds for contributions from lobbyists, campaign consultants, donors from the previous election cycle, and minors of donors. We recommend expanding that to include donations from state vendors, grant recipients, clients of lobbyists, bundlers, party committees, and candidate committees.
Alex, what about, I didn't see unions on that list. Are you proposing that we match union contributions?
That's not something we took a position on one way or the other, but we can certainly think about that and
Why not?
get back to you. Our 12th recommendation is to establish sure winner provisions. Sure winner provisions prevent payouts to candidates who only have nominal opposition. We recommend you look at the CFB's criteria for this. What they do is provide less of a payment to a candidate whose opponent has not received an endorsement from elected officials or member organizations, has not received significant media exposure, or none of their family members have run for public office before. Our next 4 recommendations relate to ensuring fairness between non-participants and participants in the public financing program. This is very important. It's important to create equity between the two, so we keep the participation rates up for all candidates. And the most important thing the Commission can do, which goes to our 13th recommendation, is to establish lower contribution limits for all offices and party committees, including doing business restrictions. For the lower contribution limits, you heard about this a bit already. 39 states have contribution limits. New York's are the highest, at least for the governor. We think they should be lowered. The median across the country is $3,800 for governor, $1,000 for state legislature. We recommend you look at the larger states of Florida and Illinois. Illinois in particular, the individual limits are $5,800 per election cycle, and they are lifted in the face of large independent expenditures or self-funded candidates, which we think addresses the concern about independent expenditures that Speaker Hastie has raised, and so we recommend taking a look at that. We also think party committee contribution limits should be lowered, and we think ideally a doing business restriction would be put in place on campaign contributions like New York City's. If there isn't the political will for that, we think at the very least contributions from vendors when bidding on a contract or having immediately won a contract should be prohibited, and any associated lobbying.
Can I ask, Alex, just a quick question on the link between the qualifying, the contribution match, and if you're going to recommending lowering limits, why only match contributions up to a certain amount versus the first portion of that contribution?
So I will say when we made these recommendations, we're not suggesting that all of them necessarily work together, but the goal here is to incentivize and encourage small donor fundraising. So we want to provide taxpayer funds that match a small contribution, and obviously there are individuals and entities that have a lot of influence in the political process already, and so we think they ought to have lower contributions than regular, everyday New Yorkers.
Can I ask a question? Have you looked at the disparity in income in the various assembly districts and state senate districts? So for instance, whether it be upstate or even in the city of New York, you have an average median income way lower in some districts, much harder to get to the threshold and to get the individual contributions. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Have you looked at the potential of breaking up the state into quartiles, I put it, of average median income, lowest, lower than average, then above average and higher, what the impact would be by changing the matching from 6 to 1, which would be the standard, to maybe even something higher in the lower average median income, maybe 12 to 1.
So we didn't take a position on that in part because we were looking at the models that exist and we were unable to find a model like that. We're certainly open to it. I think it would make sense to perhaps provide a greater match on in-district contributions or to have a higher match in areas of the state where people don't have as much money. We didn't take a position on that here, but we're certainly open to hearing recommendations from the Commission about it. So I'll go on to our 15th recommendation, which was to limit war chests for candidates. War chests are campaign contributions accumulated over time by candidates, usually over several election cycles, and that can give them an unfair advantage vis-a-vis challengers. And so we think that should be limited in some way, at the very least. Contributions raised during a previous cycle, if there are new lower contribution limits for the current campaign, the overage should be returned or given to a centralized fund. Similarly, if expenditures are made by candidates before opting into a public financing program, they should make an equivalent payment to a centralized fund for the program. And we also believe that, like Councilmember Kalos's bill in New York City, it might be worthy to look at getting donors written permission if they previously donated, to see if the contribution should be used for a current campaign, and also having candidates create one primary campaign committee. Our 16th recommendation is to ban corporate campaign contributions. 22 states do so. Most corporations give through their PACs. We don't see why they need to give through their general treasuries.
Alex, once again, what about the inconsistency there with the unions? I mean, as you know, federal law prohibits corporate LLC union contributions. Why do you suggest a different take here in New York?
We didn't take a position on that, but I will tell you that most unions also spend through their PACs, and we wouldn't necessarily be opposed to limiting union spending from their general, funds also. I think most of these entities do so through their PACs, and that's what should be done. That's what's appropriate.
With all due respect, when you lay out a position with respect to one and are silent to others, that's taking a position. So I just ask that you, if you can, take some time to think through the parity that we're creating here, because it seems like things are getting out of balance.
Sure, we can do that. I mean, I will say part of our, our recommendations were really motivated by what's kind of been discussed previously, but I hear your point. Our last two recommendations relate to providing information to the public. We think any candidates opting into the public financing system should be required to debate, to provide information about their candidacies to the public. The commission should take some time to come up with debate criteria. It's frequently been changed in New York City. We also think there should be a voter guide created online, not in paper, which is quite a bit of the cost associated with the administration of the program for the city, and actually is something that led to the differential between the state board's estimate and Michael Malvin's.
Before your time runs out, I have one question of something I just didn't understand. In recommendation 2, you say mandatory audit should include all committees seeking to influence the outcome of the election. Are you suggesting that this agency would audit all PACs that make contributions to any state race?
Just for expenditures. So, for example, if there was an independent expenditure committee in a particular district, we would want that committee to also be audited, not just the candidate committees.
So
The city audits candidate committees, but they also review independent expenditure committees.
Alex, so you're recommending random audits with respect to legislative offices expending public funds,
But full audits
but
on
full
PACs.
audits of private dollars?
We're recommending mandatory audits for all statewide offices. We're recommending mandatory audits for state legislative districts where a certain threshold of money is spent, say $1 million, we can specify, and random audits for the remainder. But we're saying any audits that are done, whether they're random or mandatory, should look at all candidate committees and all independent expenditure committees that spend in that district.
But there's random audits of public dollars being spent by some of these candidates.
Correct. The reality is, it's less than ideal, unless you're going to provide a lot more money to the administrative agency, but it's a 2-year election cycle, we've got hundreds of candidates.
Yeah, listen, I understand the administrative burden of it, but I don't think, there's a certain responsibility to ensure public dollars are being properly spent.
The state wants to spend the money for more administration, I think we support that, if they want to do more audits.
Would you support not mandatory audits of private dollars and shift those administrative resources to the public finance candidates?
Look, it's about allocation of scarce resources, so we think that we can't just only audit candidates that accept public financing. There's a lot of money that's spent privately through independent expenditure committees, and we think there needs to be campaign of finance enforcement across the board.
Member Galvin, if I could, you had asked for some time. We are 2 minutes ahead. So if you had anything left.
No, seem to be the only one that Alex would cut off and not allow me to ask my questions during the panel, and there are some gross
I apologize. I was just trying to get through my recommendations,
Whatever.
that's all.
There are some gross inconsistencies in his written testimony and errors that I'll correct with the commissioners. But since this was to actually have a deliberative discussion and he didn't seem eager to answer, I'll do it on my own time with all of you.
I would like to take some of Kim's time then. If she was asking a question about independence, and you said you'd get to it later, what do you view as nonpartisan independent committee? I don't know what that means. Am I
Elected?
independent? Are we independent?
Yeah, so what I was referencing on the later part was the independent budget. We think that's obviously critical to the independence. We spoke about some of the penalty schedule in law takes away discretion from the board, so that creates more independence. And we are going to release at a subsequent hearing detailed recommendations on the structure and function of the board, but we have not got into the granular details
Just to
yet.
conclude, the city's campaign finance board, how are they appointed?
They were appointed by elected officials. You have 5 members, 2 appointed by the mayor, 2 by the city council, and then a chair is chosen, I believe, jointly.
And it's your position that that's
Independent?
sufficient independence?
I think the city is very different because first they have a unicameral legislature. Secondly, they have a culture of independence that was built up through the board over time.
And they have a one-party system, basically.
Yes, and it's very unique and apart from how ideally you might look at something in the abstract and construct it. And so I think that has to be taken into account. If I was starting from scratch, I probably would not create a CFB the way it's structured now, but I think because they've had a culture from the beginning and some exceptional commissioners that created that culture, it works very well.
All right, forgive me. I'm
Sir,
sorry.
can I just say one small
Sure,
thing?
Deborah.
Whenever you're providing us a future hearing, recommendations around that, would you also think about the interplay between some of your recommendations? We're charged with creating a system that works cohesively across the board, and so it would be helpful to think about how your recommendations around contribution limits plays with your recommendations around what portion of those contributions to match. And then you also referenced data that you had analyzed about competitive races. If you have any of that in a way that's shareable with the commission, that would be very helpful for us to see from the 2018 election.
Great.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
can provide all of that, and thank you for letting
Thank
me
you.
go over
It's
on my
appreciated.
time.
Thank you. Okay, Evan Davis. And Mr. Davis, you'll give us your full name and the organization that you're representing, please, and thank you for coming. Okay, this we did this.
So my name is Evan Davis, and I'm representing the Committee to Reform the State Constitution, which has proposed a number of amendments to the Constitution in the voting area, in the ethics area, in the education area, in the equal rights area. And we build on our experience with that in making our suggestions today. And I'm going to talk about 2 areas. One is the appropriate agency issue. Should it be a new agency? And what is independence, and how do you secure independence, which were questions that were asked, are important questions. So the Board of Elections is not, by any conceivable definition, independent. Its members are effectively chosen by the 2 major political parties. I'm not sure I agree that the "I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine" is the standard way of life, but certainly a public perception exists to that effect. So the board does not have a reputation for independence, and it's so important that the enforcement and administration of this public money for a public financing program be truly independent, that I believe, and we believe, a new agency must be created. So how do you make the new agency independent? Minority Leader Kolb tried to make Jacob independent by having the judges appoint all the members. The Assembly minority passed a bill to that effect. I'm not sure that we want the judges to appoint all the members here, but this should certainly be a group where the appointees are made by all three branches of government: the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. Campaign finance, in general, applies to the judiciary. There's contribution limits for judges. They happen to be extremely high. I'm not sure the highness is always the practical effect in a judicial election, but they are very high. And if all three branches of government were making appointments, that would provide a reasonable measure of independence. Now, what is the disadvantage to creating a new agency? I would say the only disadvantage is that there are certain efficiencies in having the campaign finances of those participating in the program and those not participating in the program covered by the same agency. They're going to be monitoring contributions, they're going to be monitoring expenditures, they're going to be monitoring disclosure of receipts and expenditures, they're going to be doing enforcement. So having an agency with both those powers is a good idea. So we would recommend that the new agency have the entire campaign finance mandate. And as Alex said, the Board of Elections would be limited to registering voters, and hopefully getting voters registered as much as possible, and running elections. And the campaign finance would be in this new agency. So you're going to ask whether that is within your jurisdiction, within your mandate to do that.
No, it clearly is within our mandate. It specifically says we shall either find a new agency or put it in an existing agency.
So, yes, but the part about moving existing campaign finance for non-participants to this agency as well raises a little bit different question. So I brought with me two things. Here is part XXX, which is your mandate. And here is part HHH, which was the Pay Commission's mandate. And your mandate is much broader than the Pay Commission mandate. If you go through the recent decision by Judge Platkin, where he struck down the limitation on outside income, the language in part HHH that he relied on, things like the committee shall determine whether there should be an increase, warrant an increase. And that's the only determination that that commission was able to make, whether there would be an increase. Whereas you are to determine all the components and details of the public financing program. So the wording that the judge relied on is not in part XXX. And I think you have the authority and ability to do that. Now, I'm not saying Judge Platkin made the right decision even in that case before him, because he did acknowledge that part HHH was ambiguous. And normally when there's ambiguity, courts look to the purpose. And he did not do that. He did not look to the purpose. But putting that aside, the reasoning he made based on the text could not be made with respect to part XXX, because that language is not there. So you have the ability to really move the ball forward by creating a separate campaign finance entity that would handle both public financing and non-participants, where there'd be full, efficient monitoring across the board, enforcement across the board. It would be, I think, a very important step forward.
Excuse me, I'm still stuck on the notion of the independence. I'm not hearing, are you recommending that independence would be achieved by appointees coming from each branch of government rather than political persuasion?
So I think it would, I mean, you can never have perfect independence, but I think it would greatly increase independence if the chief judge and the presiding justices made some appointments, the governor, the attorney general, and the controller made some appointments, and the legislative leaders made some appointments.
Equal numbers of appointments?
Pardon?
Equal numbers of appointments?
Well, I have found in working on bills in Albany, the thing you spend the most time on is the appointment mechanism for any particular commission, because it's a highly charged issue.
Because it's not independent.
Right,
Right.
right. So it is important that it be independent, and I would say at least of the three branches, they should all have the same number of appointments. Whether you follow the practice of giving the majority leader more appointments than the minority leader, I don't really.
But sir, not to interrupt, but you're dealing here with candidates running for office from different parties. And if the appointees are all from the same party, how is that independent of any, how are you including?
No, that would be
your
important, that the legislative appointees would have to come from both the minority and the majority caucuses. So there would be from two different parties. And you could even require the judiciary and the governor to make appointments. We have many instances where the governor is not allowed to appoint simply Democrats. The governor must appoint. So you'd have to think about it. I think
That does exist, and if you then devolve into a situation where you have equal numbers from each side of the aisle again, why don't you run into the problem you're raising? I'll take issue with the back-scratching comment with the Board of Elections. I see it as checks on each other's abuses, and that's what I'm more fearful of, and that's more consistent with the underpinnings.
so. I think by adding the judiciary, having them make appointments as
The appointed judiciary or the elected judiciary?
well, it would be the PJs and the chief judge. So the PJs are elected and appointed, both, and the chief judge is appointed by a nominating process.
Isn't truly the only way to have an independent person is to have them elected by the people of the state of New York?
Well, you could argue for electing a chief.
It's $100 million at least of public money with
Right.
CPI clauses going to increase the cost, and if it's effective, is going to be many, many hundreds of millions of dollars at the end. I mean, certainly that budget is bigger than the public advocate in the
if you
city
were
of New
going to-
York.
If you're going to have an election, I think it should be a nonpartisan election.
If I could just interject for a second, and I agree with you on the Board of Elections, both on the local and the state level. I looked at it as more stabbing than scratching, frankly. But I would say to you that the difficulty you're always going to have, be it elected or appointed by this one or that, is in this case, currently, it's going to lean more Democratic, just as it is. It's not going to be bipartisan. in
But then the
sense.
people have
model-
chosen it.
The model, well, even so, then in a state where the elected officials tend to end up being, right now anyway, Democratic at this moment, you're still going to have that potential. And then are they going to be covered by campaign finance to get elected? So what I'm just suggesting is maybe, why couldn't we have a model in a separate agency that was set up the same way, equal between the two parties in the
Well,
campaign
because then
finance review?
basically you're setting up the Board of Elections again.
Yeah.
Only you don't have the history, you don't have the 120,000 campaign finance reviews, you don't have the body of knowledge, you don't have the ballot access that triggers many of these funding mechanisms, you don't have any of that history or those people or the necessary inexplicably intertwined parts of ballot access that trigger a public financing program, they have to start from fresh. They don't have a human resources department, they don't have an IT department. It's going to increase your costs by multipliers, and that comes off the top of the money that we're trying to encourage the program for.
Well, I think we can have this debate on
Well,
this, but I think the concept, and I agree, what I'm trying to say, I'm agreeing with you,
Right.
that we've got, however it comes out,
Right.
it's got to be something that is equal, and it's got to be nonpartisan in that approach.
I just.
I agree that the focus should be on nonpartisan rather than bipartisan.
It's just, it's hard to accomplish
It's
nonpartisan.
not easy to accomplish,
There's no such
but you
thing.
have to try to come up with the mechanism. And since judges are included in campaign finance, there's no reason not to have the judiciary make appointments. There's
We
no
also have-
reason not to have the attorney general and the controller, in addition to the governor, make appointments.
So we don't have a bipartisan electorate. A third of the electorate does not belong to either the Republican or the Democratic Party. And the question is, if you're going to create something based upon the political entities keeping an eye on each other, I don't think you can eliminate the third of the political culture that isn't represented by either of those two parties.
And you want to be sure that, since the goal is to encourage people to run, that this is not done with a pro-incumbent bias. And the Board of Elections, with its current appointment structure by the two major political parties, has, I think, a
And the
degree-
governor has an appointment on there.
No.
Yes,
To the Board of Elections?
yes.
The nominations are made by the two political parties.
Andrew
And-
Spano is
and-
the governor's appointment.
And then the governor appoints from those nominations, but it has to be someone who comes up through the political
So actually, he has
parties.
all four if he gets to pick who they are.
Right, but they have to come up through the political parties, and that's true in the city as well, and in boards of elections in the counties. They are all originate as nominated by the political parties.
Because our Constitution requires, at least at a county level, a bipartisan administration of elections.
Right, but it doesn't require a bipartisan administration of campaign finance programs. That
Which
you
is-
could do with something.
Which is
with a new-
integral in running for election, as we're all
Right,
noticing and
it's very
taking note of.
important, but campaign finance is logic. One reason it's logically separated is campaign finance presents not only a fairness issue for voters and getting, real participatory input into elections, but it also, Albany is currently quite awash in special interest money. And this is a ray of hope. What you are doing is a ray of hope to change that situation and to make it more smaller donors, more large donors in the current system are a source, the main source of conflict of interest.
I agree with all the functionality of many of the proposals for public financing, regardless of my personal position on it. I've met with a lot of groups. I agree with much of it. It just, when it comes to the administration of the agency, everyone says, the Board of Elections is deadlocked. I've worked there for 10 years. And the 100,000 or 25,000 reviews we've done in the compliance unit since the reformation in 2014, I would say the politics in it is almost non-existent. It's the enforcement wing that needs the protections that you're talking about, not the general reviews of the filers.
Well, there's a lot in administration that could be abused in a way that would be harmful. It's not only enforcement, I think, but also nonpartisan administration. Nonpartisan enforcement, nonpartisan administration, I think are both critical. So the other topic I wanted to address briefly was campaign contribution limits. And as one of the people who spoke here this morning said, there is a connection between the contribution limits for people who are not participating in the program and the contribution limits for people who participate in the program. And if you create a big differential between the two, then you discourage participation because people are going to be afraid that they will not be able to respond to potentially massive spending by their opponent or in independent expenditures or the like. So it would be, to make this system work and stay within the $100 million, it would be good to bring down the contribution limits for non-participants. And I think you have the power to do that for the same reason that you have the power to create a new campaign finance agency. And that
Let me just interrupt you there, because
Use the mic.
the statute specifically gives us the power to create a new agency.
but it doesn't give
But
you
it
the-
also specifically says that we can set contribution limits applicable to candidates participating in the program. Now, don't we have that axiom, which I never got in Latin, inclui, uni, exclui, all the rest of the stuff?
The reason I don't think that Latin doctrine applies is that just before that, with equal vigor, it says, you shall determine all the details and components of the system. And then it says, you shall also determine da-da-da-da. So it gives you a checklist. For instance, you have to look at fusion voting. You can decide not to do anything about it, but you have to look at it. That's on your checklist.
So,
But-
Mr. Davis,
but
you're
the gen-
referring to the section that says, identify all details and components reasonably related to administration.
Right,
And there's a relationship between contribution limits for
exactly.
participants and non-participants.
It's
That's a
reasonably
relation.
related, and therefore, it's within your purview. And it would make the system work so much better if we didn't have, 22,000 for a Democratic primary for statewide office, 47,000 in the general. These humongous numbers just distort what can be done. They're also part of the reason that, as I say, Albany has much too much special interest money influencing decisions. And if the contribution limits were lower for both participants and non-participants, you could maintain the incentive to participate, and you could address this problem of excessive.
What methodology could you use to determine that relationship, though, to what that spread should be? How do you go about doing that in a way that works?
Well, one of the people talked about running simulations.
Professor Malcolm?
That's a mathematical approach. I'm not an expert on that. But I would just try to keep the two very, very close. Maybe have even no difference. If you reduce the contribution limits for everybody, then have no difference for the candidates participating in the program, because that would maximize their desire.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Davis. Thank you
Thank
for your
you.
time. Chisholm Lee?
Thank you.
This now. Thank you.
Oh, isn't that nice? Thank you. Mr. Melnichek. Thank you. And again, I'm just going to ask you to restate your name and the organization that you're representing for the record. Please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Chi-Sun Lee. I'm a senior counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. I'm joined by my colleague, Counsel Joanna Zidenise. Thank you for inviting us to testify. We've also submitted written testimony attaching some of our pertinent research and detailed legislative recommendations. So today, we want to really touch on some of the key points and look forward to hopefully talking with you further today and in the months to come. We are at your service, to each and every one of you. First, I wanted to take a quick moment for the record to appreciate the historic nature of your task. This spring, our state's elected leaders recognized the need for transformative change to restore New Yorkers' trust in government. They appointed you to design a system of voluntary public financing that will meet 3 goals: to incentivize candidates to seek small donations, to reduce pressure on candidates to seek large donations, and to encourage qualified candidates to run for office. By itself, this mandate is historic, and we know from working with people and lawmakers across the country that it's not just historic here, but your work is being watched by people all over this country. Our state is at the leading edge of a movement that is catching hold everywhere to restore the people's trust in democracy by amplifying the voices of regular people in the post-Citizens United era. Earlier this year, the U.S. House of Representatives passed small donor public financing as part of its omnibus pro-democracy package called the For the People Act. A number of cities and counties, including our own Suffolk County, have adopted this reform in the past few years. But New York would be the first state to do this on a large scale and set a pathway for the nation to follow. But mainly we want to focus on the nature of the problems this commission was appointed to solve and explain why the policy model that we advocate is the solution that will work best to address these problems. Again, for the record, I just want to run through some of the extensive evidence that we have showing that a very small pool of very large donors dominate the state's campaign financing system, and this status quo has bred public mistrust of our political process in Albany. We know that New York ranks consistently among the bottom of states in participation of small donors. In February, we reported that small donations of $200 or less made up less than 5% of the money that state candidates raised in the most recent election cycle, and that the biggest 100 donors gave more than all of the roughly 137,000 small donors combined. We also have research that shows that when too few small donors participate, this critical part of the political process lacks economic and racial diversity. Big donors tend to live in wealthier, whiter neighborhoods with higher levels of college education and employment than where small donors live. And a campaign finance system that enables large donors to dominate is hardly a recipe for representative democracy. And we know from the work of the Moreland Commission to investigate public corruption several years ago, which concluded that the biggest scandals of money in politics in New York are the legal ones, made possible by laws that, quote, make it easy to raise very large sums of money from a very small number of special interest donors, and do not provide an alternative source of funding. They found that large donors are able to gain special access to lawmakers, while ordinary citizens lack the access that money can buy. The Moreland Commission ultimately recommended that New York adopt a public financing system like the one in New York City, and the Brennan Center agrees. We recommend this system, which we call small donor public financing, which in a nutshell, as we've been discussing, provides a multiple match on small donations that residents give to candidates who are able to show enough community support to qualify and who agree to lower contribution limits and other restrictions. And we recommend this model based on research that shows it will meet your statutory goals. Research shows that it will amplify the role of small donors. We applied the features of the governor's most recent small donor public financing bill, which provided a 6-to-1 match on small donations, to actual fundraising in the 2018 cycle by state candidates. We found that under the 6-to-1 match with some other aspects of the bill, candidates, instead of raising only 5% of their funds from small donors, could have raised 30% of their funds from small donors without changing anything else about their behavior. This morning, we actually published a study that compares fundraising of publicly financed city council candidates in New York City with privately financed state assembly candidates who ran for office in districts of approximately the same size in the same neighborhoods. And we found that the publicly financed candidates raised a far larger portion of their funds from small donors. Nearly 50% of what they raised came from small donors, compared to just 5% for the candidates who could not opt into small donor public financing. Now, that might be expected because the multiple match system, the point of it is to enhance the value of small donations. But what was remarkable to us is how much more the publicly financed candidates connected with donors in their own districts for support. In-district donors, the candidates' future constituents, formed 45% of the publicly financed candidates' donor pool, compared to just 17% of the privately financed candidates' donor pool. And we know from research we conducted several years ago with the Campaign Finance Institute that the 6-to-1 match brings a more economically and racially diverse group of donors into the political process compared to state donors, including in the lowest income neighborhoods. So this body of research shows that small donor public financing is the right model to grow the role of small donors, bring more diversity to the ranks of those who donate, and it strengthens the ties between candidates and the local residents they seek to represent. Beyond these benefits, the sheer longevity and popularity of New York City's program are proof that it is a successful model for this commission to follow. You've heard participation rates are high by candidates. They're also high among small donors, regular New Yorkers who want to give to candidates they support and participate in their democracy. This model will enable the commission to meet your goals, and in order to do that, the details matter. You have to design a program that will appeal to many serious candidates, because a program that nobody wants to use will not succeed in meeting the statutory goals. So I want to turn it over to my colleague to run through the key aspects that we think the program has to include. I first very quickly wanted to hit on a point that I believe Commissioner Jacobs and Commissioner Berger, you had raised with Michael Malvin earlier. The sort of question, what if everybody competes? There's a lot more competition. What are we going to do? Everyone's going to hit their match caps, and we've maxed out the commission's spending authority in a heartbeat. I think it's very critical to understand one of the beauties of the small donor match system is that it tracks with the competitiveness of real candidates in the real world. So, first of all, a candidate would need to qualify to receive matching funds. It's not easy. Of course, it can't be too hard for somebody with reasonable amounts of community support, but not anybody can come by and say, I would like to qualify for matching funds. There's a real test to meet. And then, once qualified, every candidate needs to earn every dollar of matching funds that she or he receives. They need to find enough support from enough small donors to put in for a match on that amount of money. And so it's hardly the case that every candidate will be able to jump in, qualify for matching funds, and somehow be competitive up to the level of receiving the maximum amount of public funding.
Thank you, Ms. Lee, and thank you to the commissioners. So as my colleague noted, I'm just going to briefly run through the essential principles that this commission should follow when designing this system, with specifics on a few of the most important choices that you're going to have to make. First, to create a small donor public financing system that many serious candidates will want to use, the program needs to provide the possibility of raising competitive levels of funding. Critical to doing so is matching contributions at a sufficiently high ratio. Doing so makes outreach to small donors, including constituents, a winning political strategy consistent with the goals that this commission has been tasked to meet. We recommend matching up to the first $200 of an eligible contribution at a 6-to-1 rate. So in that way, an eligible contribution of $10 would become worth $70 to the candidate, making a small contribution go a long way toward helping candidates raise competitive sums of money.
The city recently, after years of experience, amended its law to go from 6 to 1 to 8 to 1. Have you considered that? I mean, clearly there was some thought behind doing that based on many, many years of experience, and they've decided to make the change. Have you considered that at all in your thought process?
Yes, our recommendations are based off of the long-standing model of New York City's program before those changes were made, which has been adopted in jurisdictions across the country. As Professor Melvin noted in his testimony earlier, he's interested in taking a closer look at the effect of a higher match. And we do recommend, as Professor Melvin noted, a higher 8-to-1 match ratio for in-district contributions to further incentivize fundraising from
Can I ask you also to address, you may not be able to do it right now, this concept of the average median income in various parts of the state and even in the city of New York being different, and maybe in order to recognize that you're going to be competing in certain areas of lower income, that it would be more difficult to get the number on the threshold to contribute, and the amount that they can contribute might be much lower. Perhaps we could look at, for the lower average median income districts, a 12-to-1 or even higher match point, and 6-to-1 for maybe the average median income and above. And what would be the implications of that financially, so that we're balancing out a program that isn't one size fits all, because not every district is the same as it relates to the income. Not, in Cattaraugus County and Chautauqua, it's much different than, and in some parts of Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, than it is perhaps in Nassau County, where I come from, or, on the Upper West Side of New York, different.
Yeah, I think we have a couple of responses to that and to Commissioner Berger's question here. The first is that we're hardly wedded to the exact formulas we have recommended. They're recommended because they've worked in the past and we think they've worked well. And a couple of points. New York City has had the same formula apply to everybody. And what we've seen in some of the research I described, even in low-income districts, you see high participation by candidates and by donors. Be that as it may, we're not closed to a differential, a regionally differential, or income-based differential, but we would stress very strongly two things: that any different approach needs to be modeled and projected to see what the impacts would be based on current campaign finance and participation data. And we do think that Michael Malvin earlier is the best positioned. We understand that he has all the geocoded data sets and census data on income distribution and so forth. And the other thing is that we would respectfully really urge the Commission, if you consider going down this path, to please consult with us about legal implications, because I'm not going to elaborate right now, but there may be questions raised about differential treatment of different donors, different candidates, because every individual in every district is not the same as everybody else around them. So we would want to be able to look closely at a design and be able to give our opinion on that.
Just a question, just to clarify, because I'm truly not sure about this. In the city of New York, if you're running in a council district, matching funds, is it only for in-district? I thought it didn't have to be just in-district, right?
It's in the city.
It's in the city. Or is it? No, I think it's beyond the city.
It's
No,
citywide.
The match is in the city.
I'm sorry?
It's citywide.
It's citywide,
Yes.
okay. So you could be in a lower income, let's say, average median income council district, but yet you could be attracting donations across the board. We're looking, at least I am anyway, at in-district, and I think there's the limitation that needs some attention to modify somehow the ability of candidates in those lower average median income districts to be able to compete, in races.
What are
appropriately.
your views on that? Do the contributions to qualify have to be in-district, or could they be from beyond the district?
I believe the qualifying contributions are in district. Yes, and I think Commissioner Jacob raises the critical question, which is balancing the need to ensure that every candidate who's able to qualify can raise competitive sums of money. So, a match that applied only to in-district contributions would be very difficult to design well, so that candidates in every district had access to competitive levels of funding if nobody else is going to be matched. But what I think I hear is a desire to centralize and amplify the importance of in-district donors to a candidate because constituents matter the most. We've tried to address this with proposing a higher match ratio for donors from within the district of where the candidate is going to be running. There may be other ways, but again, I think it's important to consider what the legal implications are in addition to whether candidates would be able to raise enough to compete. And in New York City, even in the poorest districts, donors in those districts have participated at far higher levels in public financed campaigns than in state campaigns where there's no option of public financing. And candidates have been able to raise enough money to run under the public financing system.
A candidate wants to know that he or she is competitive. If all the candidates within a race are treated exactly the same, so in this race, I know I'm getting a 4-to-1 match, or in this race, I know that I and all my competitors are getting an 8-to-1 match. Where does the problem arise from that? They know they're going to be treated the same, so they're going to be competitively equal.
Right. Well, it also raises the question of incentivizing or disincentivizing candidates to even opt into the public financing system, because if what's available within a district-only match is a pretty limited amount of funding, and not opting in enables you to raise from whomever is a viable contributor under the law, you've designed a system where it's really difficult for a candidate who wants to opt in if that is a serious candidate who really thinks she or he has a shot of winning.
But to your point, and to support your position, the qualifying dollars, just for clarity, do have to be raised in district, correct? So you have to show that you are a viable candidate within your own district, and then you just can fundraise outside of it. But the initial okay to enter into the program and receive the funds is an in-district.
That's
Right,
correct.
threshold.
We recommend
Right.
collecting qualifying contributions from in-district and having those having any eligible contributions matched by New York State residents.
Right.
So can I say one other thing here for, just in line with the issue of differing districts. I'm concerned about the focus on New York City, where you have a set of factors that are much more similar applying to all candidates, and when you try to apply that to a diverse state, it may not work. And in addition to differences in median income, I'm concerned about differences in the cost of running a campaign. And so if you're in an expensive media market, for example, Lower Hudson Valley, Long Island, and you're getting the same dollar amount as somebody maybe in the North Country or Southern Tier, whether or not you're disadvantaging that candidate against or their ability to compete against, i.e. money or other spending, and if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and that's dealt with through the setting of what the match cap is, the maximum amount of public funding that's available. And we've heard arguments on both sides. It's too low, it's too high. And so the policy we've designed and recommend answers both of those concerns. For the concern that it's too high, I go back to what I was saying earlier, which is the max amount of public funding is not going to be given to every person, only to candidates who actually have that much small donor support and are that competitive that they could actually raise more and more public funding up to the cap. And it seems very unlikely that that's going to happen across the board all over the state. And to the concern that it's not enough in some districts, or for some races. We know some years certain races really get very, very competitive. That's why we recommend no limits on what a participating candidate can raise or spend individually, except subject to the individual contribution.
Can I ask a question? Yeah.
To respond to the possibility of big outside spending.
Just on a question I'd like to raise, which you weren't able to get to in your 20 minutes, and that has to do with this idea of an independent body to administer this program. Can you just run through for the commission your recommendations as to the composition of this commission? Not us, but a commission to, or a body to administer the public financing program. It's on page 1 of your, it's summarized on page 1 of your report.
So I'll note that there are a number of ways that this could be achieved, a number of ways that the system could be administered. What we have proposed is consistent with how, first of all, a number of agencies within the state have been appointed, but also how other public financing systems across the country are administered.
Which proposal, your first one or your second one?
So we've submitted one set of model bill recommendations to this commission, as well as I believe the commissioner is referring to the briefing book that we.
Yes.
Yeah, and the Fair Elections Board, and how you
That's the second
how you would
proposal.
provide that, for that board to be appointed. That's my question. Could you just
So
review
we
that?
have recommended having a 5-member board appointed by the governor on advice and consent of the Senate through a mechanism where each of the legislative leaders, majority and minority, submits several candidates to the governor for consideration and then to be appointed.
Yeah, I would just say, as we have said in casual conversation with Commissioner Galvin, it's not so much our exact structure that we're wedded to. It's a couple of key principles for the public, for New Yorkers, and for
I've agreed.
candidates who are.
And I've agreed with you. in
Yes,
this
and the key principles are the public needs to trust, because this is their money, that this program is going to be administered fairly without any partisan or bipartisan favor or disfavor, and the structure of a body is crucial to what the public will believe the body's motivations are. And then the other key principle is that candidates who are considering participating need to have confidence that the program is going to be administered, again, fairly, efficiently, quickly. There are going to be, of course, a number of wrinkles to iron out in the beginning about what happens in this circumstance. Is this legal? Is this fair? Are all candidates treated equally? In which circumstances? And so candidates also, in order to opt in, which is the only way this commission's goals succeed, need to have reasonable confidence that the agency is going to be resourced, professional, and together enough on the inside to be able to make some of these hard choices quickly. So those are our guiding principles.
Now, while you're taking into consideration all these different components of the economic standard, will you also incorporate a column regarding the race and diversity within these communities in districts?
Well, so that's one of the encouraging benefits that we found in our research with the Campaign Finance Institute, and that's Michael Malvin who spoke before, looking at how this program has worked in New York City, which is really the only basis we have for studying how this works in real life because it's been around for so long. We have found that under the city's 6-to-1 match, over time, you see far greater participation by donors who are more racially diverse and socioeconomically diverse in every other way, including in lower income districts in the city, compared to the status quo at the state level now, where you have an overwhelmingly white and wealthy donor pool.
And I just have one other comment to make, based upon partly our what I thought was a very productive conversation prior to this meeting. One of the things I'm interested in is, and this committee I think has to consider extensively, is all of these proposals seem to have an increase in the contributions amounts with the CPI. And when in 1974, whatever the year was, where everything was reconstructed, the limits were much, much lower, and they've just naturally gone up. So all of these proposals contain a provision where they escalate based upon the CPI. And so down the road, aren't we going to be faced with the very same high contribution limits as we're fighting against right now?
But won't they
Do
all
we
be
have to- do we
relative
have-
to each other, though? Because I think that the key issue is
But that's how
striking
we
the
got
balance
here,
relative
right?
to
With
each
the
other.
adjustments through the CPI. So if we continue to do that down the road, aren't we going to be faced with what we're all going to say, oh dear, look at these limits again?
Well, I think, first, we think that contribution limits in the state need to come down. They are exorbitantly high compared to the
Okay,
rest
so
of the
let's
nation. But, sorry, go
Let's
ahead.
assume that we all agree. Let's just say for
Yes.
the sake of argument,
Right.
we all agree they have to come down, and let's for purposes say, you know, $5,000. Over time, that $5,000 is gonna grow, and people, hopefully, dear Lord, not me, will be sitting here 20 years from now saying, the limits are too high. Why do we all have these automatic increase clauses in all of these proposals as opposed to a flat contribution limit?
Well, cost of living goes up. no?
Right, everything else is
Cost
going to
of living
increase
goes
as
up,
well.
so-
Yeah, but that's how we got
I know,
here.
but Abe Lincoln would have had it at $50. I mean, we couldn't keep it that way.
I believe the statute, I think the statutory limit on a party committee is like $25,000 in the law. Right now, it's at 117. It's what we're finding so offensive is not what was passed.
That's right.
initially, It's the growth over time. And that's, I believe Kim's point
Right.
is, we're saying it's excessively high. It's high because the cost of living adjustments warrant the increases, but at the same time, it's excessively high. So how do we reconcile those two?
Right.
But at the same time, we also have a legislature and a governor that would be free at any time to pass laws to adjust the system appropriately down the road. And, I mean, I still remember when the subway was, you used tokens, and the subway was 35 cents
Right,
growing
well-
up here. So I mean, I think this is a debate we should engage in, and I appreciate where you're coming from. I did have one question, which was, how important do you think it is to the system to be effective for campaign contribution limits to be reduced?
We think it's extremely important. The commission's
won't opt
mandate
in.
is to incentivize candidates to seek out small donations, which would require, in the first instance, that they want to participate in the program. And so contributions and limits need to come down for the first reason, just to incentivize candidates to want to reach out to seek small donations in the first place. And for the second reason, for candidates to want to opt in, contribution limits also outside the program need to be reduced. Otherwise, a rational person has a very hard time, given how much one can raise right now under the state limits, opting into a small donor public financing system.
If I could, by request of some of the members, and I thank you for your testimony, I'd like to ask if we could just hold the next testimony until 12:40, giving us a little bit of a time for a break. I know a few members have said they needed a little bit of a break, and then we'll start. We'll be a little bit behind, but I think we can catch up because there's time built in at the end, if that's okay. We'll still take the same lunch break, if that's all right with the members. Is that?
What time is that?
So the lunch break would then be 20 minutes behind. So
Right after the next.
right after
speaker.
the next speaker. Okay? Is that fair? So we'll take a quick break right now? Is that what everybody wants? Oh, you
Rather do the next speaker.
Okay, well, if that's what you want. Okay, then let's finish her up and let's go. Okay. I was operating on misinformation. Okay.
No, that was real information.
Oh, it's real information that changed.
But I can wait for one.
Okay.
But I
Okay.
would like to move the resolution after the next speaker before lunch.
Okay, we'll move the resolution. We have a resolution that we're going to. Yeah, we're going to, that's how we go. I think we're pretty much agreeing on everybody's. Okay, if I could ask Mr. Schwartz,
Here, I'll give it to you.
there you go. Okay. Thank you. Could you just again state your name in full and your affiliation, just for the record, please?
Okay. I just want to say that on the subway, when I first took the subway, it was a nickel. So My current job is chief counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, and I know my colleagues who previously testified, but I didn't work on their testimony, and my testimony is really historical more than current, but I have views on the current. So my name is Fritz Schwartz. I have a fancier name, but that's what I call myself, if that's okay. And I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, you're running a meeting where you have such lengthy testimony. I know, for example, when I ran the New York City Charter Commission in 1989, we would have hundreds of witnesses, but supposedly there was a 3-minute limit, and it was ridiculous. So I overruled it often, and it's good that you give people some real time.
Again, I'm not chairing this, I mean, I'm just helping to coordinate, but at 4 o'clock, we're going to have that exact example that you're talking about. I'm looking forward to it.
So my experience is in here. I mean, I'm mostly going to talk historically. I was involved in the creation of the New York City Campaign Finance Board, pushing for it for reasons I'll come to in a minute, and I was lucky enough to chair it for 5 years. And I'd just like to make a comment on being on a commission which responds to some of the questioning about independence and how you get it, and nonpartisanship and how you get it, and that's absolutely vital. The city tries to do it by a law that, with the mayor's appointments, they have to be divided. They must be of the 4, other than the chair. They cannot be more than 2 in one party. And then the chair has to be, it doesn't say anything about party, but also has to be approved by the city council speaker, which helps with diversity of partisanship, helps eliminating partisanship. Traditions make a huge difference too, and whether you can affect traditions isn't clear, but they're really vital. And with the city commission, there was an immediate tradition of independence when Father O'Hare, perhaps helped by his distinguished title of father, in one of his earliest decisions, said that Mayor Koch had violated the new law which had just come into effect. And you can't legislate independence, I don't think, but whatever you can do that enhances the likelihood of independence as well as political diversity, which I think you can control, is important. And as I say, traditions really matter. You can have the best possible structure, and if it doesn't grow in a tradition that is wise, it'll kind of fizzle out. So I'd like to talk for a minute about how come New York City had a campaign finance system. Well, it really was an example of one of my father's favorite quotations, which I always use from Shakespeare, which is, "Sweet are the uses of adversity." So from the point of view of reform, we were lucky in the city to have the scandal of 1986, 1987. Sweet was the uses of adversity there. Ed Koch, who I was corporation counsel, but I'd also become an advisor of him much more generally, was really depressed. I mean, he was thinking of committing suicide. He himself was honest, but he was really depressed about the corruption that was coming out of his administration, not him, but coming out of his administration. And when I told him I would stay with him for an extra year, Ed Koch cried. And you guys don't think of Ed Koch crying in an emotional way, but he did. But my advice to him was take advantage of the scandal and use it to devise and press for significant reforms, and by far the most important of those reforms was the campaign finance law created in 1988, I think. Other reforms too, but that was by far the most important one. Now, leadership in the legislature matters too. Peter Vallone, the speaker then, as an example of his leadership going back a little earlier, he hated the idea of gay rights because of his devout Catholicism. But as leader of the city council, he said to his members, I release you from the prohibition on gay rights law, and the city council, under Vallone's leadership, passed an excellent, in fact, the first in the country, gay rights law. So when we came along with the campaign finance proposal, the speaker, again, Speaker Peter Vallone Sr., was a leader, and that leadership really mattered. He said, I know this will create opposition to some of my members, but I think it is a useful reform and it fits with what we should be doing in the city. So sweet are the uses of adversity, and your commission has a related opportunity because of the scandals that have happened with the abuse of power and the improper acceptance of money by leaders of the state. So another thing I'd like to mention that I think is historically important, and the way you write your, I guess you guys practically write it unless there's a revolution in the legislature or something like that. You're going to be very powerful. The way you write it makes a big, big difference, and you can influence the atmosphere in the state enormously by improving the campaign finance system. It has helped the city to have a device in the law creating the board that requires the board after each election to write a report on how the law worked and changes that might be proposed. And there have been a lot of them, some purely administrative, making the Campaign Finance Board act more rapidly, which it really didn't in its first years. Audits are vital, because if you don't have a system that the citizenry believes is rigidly honest, the citizens are not going to continue to support the idea of campaign finance reform. So part of assuring that support is retained is having a good audit system, and that being done rigorously. I think under the 15 years of Father O'Hare, it hurt a little bit. He's a wonderful man, a marvelous human being. Not too well right now, but a marvelous human being. But it hurt a little bit that he wasn't himself a lawyer, because I think, from all his authority in the church, he sort of felt, well, the staff here they're the people who are the lawyers, and so I'm not going to do anything that disagrees with them. And indeed, under the 15 years of Father O'Hare, the Campaign Finance Board never differed with a audit decision made by the staff. When I took over, we did, and even though Nicole Gordon was my protege, who was the head of the staff, and our very first case involved the woman who's now Attorney General of the state of New York, who'd run only under the label of the Working Families Party, and the Campaign Finance Board had given her some huge fine or some penalty that might have queried whether she was in office. I don't exactly remember, but as I think almost the first act that I did as chair, we accepted her appeal. I don't know what lesson you can get from that, but I do think it's part of the lesson that you want real independence in the people who are working as the members, including respect for, but not just overly deferential to the staff. It was important in the evolution of the campaign finance system that the matches changed. It started at 1-to-1 on $1,000, and now it's 8-to-1 on, what is it, 125 or something like that. Actually, when I was chair of the commission, I recommended going to either it was then still, it had become, I guess, not 4-to-1, not 1-to-1 on 1,000, but 4-to-1 on 250 or something like that. Anyway, I recommended going to either 6-to-1 or 8-to-1, and for some reason, Mayor Bloomberg, who frankly was not personally concerned, thought that was an insult to him, and he got very mad at me, and I was his appointee, and he said I went on the radio for 3 Saturdays attacking me on the radio. I guess that lesson from that is you have to have a tough but kind person selected as chair. So Albany today has, you know this, and you know the facts on this better than I do, but it has many of the problems that the city had when we created the campaign finance system, and it is marvelous that this commission is addressing those. I do think per some of the questioning I heard, my hearing isn't as good as it used to be, so I can hear you much better here than I could back there. But some of the questioning indicated that you are also going to be considering the level of contribution in the state, and those levels are awfully high, whether it's because of inflation of numbers that once were reasonable, although if it's truly inflation, then, it would suggest earlier that maybe the numbers were a little high when they were first put in effect. But there's a great tradition in this country that Justice Brandeis enunciated in one of his opinions about states and cities being the laboratory. A courageous state or city can be the laboratory for democracy. And I believe that New York City was a laboratory for democracy, and I would close in talking to you by saying you have the opportunity here to be a laboratory for democracy that makes this state live up to the ideals it's always had. I mean, it has been a laboratory of democracy traditionally. Just pick one person out of the air. Franklin Roosevelt got his intellectual start, or got his reformer start, by thinking about how New York State should be governed, and that then resulted in the New Deal, which mostly was a good thing. So you have a great opportunity, the state has a great opportunity to be a laboratory for democracy, and you have an enormous opportunity to create for the state a great law that addresses the complicated questions of campaign finance.
Great. Thank you.
Fritz, it's a pleasure to see you. The New York City Campaign Finance Act and the Finance Board was created in 1987-88 and went almost immediately into the 89 election cycle. Are you familiar with how you geared up to prepare administratively to handle that and the audits and all the other pieces
Well,
of that?
I am familiar with what we did in terms of the appointment system, which I don't think is what you're driving at, to try to make sure that was likely to produce independent and nonpartisan body. But I'm not familiar, Henry, with Commissioner Berger, excuse me. I'm not familiar with the details of how administration of the commission was done. I'm quite certain from now the perspective of coming in to chair it 15 years later that it essentially was administered by a system that was invented by the staff of the commission. And I think they did, first place, one thing on which they really get high marks was being rigorous and making sure that money was not being wasted. One thing they get less high marks on was they took too long, so candidates sometimes would be under audit for like 2 years or 2.5 years, and we've done some things that, now I use we because the changes I'm now going to talk about happened when I was chair and happened even more probably under Rick Schaefer, the current chair, who worked in the Corporation Counsel's office with great distinction. But we did some things to address the too much time being spent, not fair to the candidates to be under audit for a very long time. On the other hand, you sure have to be rigorous because even under the city system, there have been examples of criminal action, when they were getting a X to 1 match. You have to have proof that you got the money. And there were people who fraudulently exaggerated their money. So you do need a tough enforcement, but it ought to be devised in a way that doesn't take forever.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I enjoyed hearing from you. We have a lunch break, and lunch is provided. I think it was an act of Congress or something that arranged it for us, but we did get it, and I'm grateful for it. So we have that. But before we do so, I promised, right, we did promise Member Galvin? You have a resolution?
Just basically for the people that are here, I'm proposing a resolution just to clarify an issue that I think many people are concerned with. Basically, I'll read it. Should I read it?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. Whereas Section XXX of Chapter 55 of the laws of 2019 establish a public campaign financing and election commission to examine, evaluate, and make recommendations for new laws with respect to how the state should implement such a system of voluntary public campaign financing for state legislative and statewide public offices. and what the parameters of such a program should be. And whereas the law called for the legislative leaders and the governor to make appointments to the commission, the 9th member of which was jointly appointed by the governor, the Speaker of the Assembly, and the Majority Leader of the New York State Senate. And whereas as of on July 3rd, 2019, the formation of the commission and its members were announced by the governor and the legislative leaders. And whereas the commission's report shall be due December 1st, 2019, and shall have the full force and effect of law unless abrogated or modified by the statute by December 22nd, 2019. And whereas enacting legislation identifies certain elements that the commission shall consider in developing this public financing program, including in Section 2, Part small j, rules, regulations governing, candidates' eligibility for public financing, political party qualifications, multiple party candidate nominations and/or designations, civil violations of public financing rules, and whereas the commission and each of the members thereof have been sued in 2 separate lawsuits in which it is claimed in sum and substance that this is an unlawful delegation of legislative authority and that the commission has no authority to eliminate quote-unquote fusion voting in the state of New York, and whereas sponsors of the legislation that debated the bill prior to the vote on the same indicated the above referenced clause, small j, was intended to be taken wholly within the context of developing a public finance program. And now, therefore, be it resolved that this Public Financing and Election Commission will only address the specific issues of multiple party candidate nominations and/or designations as those issues relate to a recommendation of a voluntary public financing program. So I'll move the resolution.
I'll second it.
This is, thank you, Kim, for giving this to us. I just got it today, so I would move to table so we can have some time to just study it and consider it, similar to how we did last time.
I'll second that motion. I think this is an important issue that we need to spend some time discussing, and we can't do it today because we're devoted today to listen to experts and to listen to the public. So this is an issue I think that we do need to resolve. This commission does need to address it. We need some discussion to do that, some careful consideration. So I will second the motion to table by Commissioner Dinnerstein.
It's been a motion to table takes precedence. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
No. Thank you very much. And now if I could ask the members, lunch for the members is right through those doors, I am told, right back there. And I think it's actually a very good one. So let's reconvene here just so we have the schedule right, so we know. We're running about 20 minutes behind. So we will reconvene here. How about, why does 1:30 look? Is that okay? 1:30? And that's when we'll take up Laura Ladd-Bierman at that time. Thank you very much.